the summer of 1346, and Europe is about to witness something that will change the face of warfare forever. But before we dive into the thunder of cannons and the whistle of arrows, we need to understand how two kings found themselves locked in a deadly game of chess that would reshape history. Edward III of England wasn't just any king. He was a man with a burning ambition, and what he believed was a rightful claim to the French throne. Through his mother, Isabella of France, he argued that he had more legitimate right to rule France than Philip VI. It sounds almost absurd now, doesn't it? An English king claiming France as his birthright. But in the medieval world, these dynastic claims were serious business, the kind that started wars lasting over a century. The 100 Years' War had been simmering for years, but by 1346, Edward decided it was time to turn up the heat. He landed in Normandy with an army that, on paper, shouldn't have stood a chance against the might of France. His force was relatively small, around 15,000 men, and they were tired from weeks of marching and raiding across French territory. But Edward had something up his sleeve that would make all the difference. Here's where the story gets really interesting. While the French still believed in the old ways of warfare, heavily armored knights charging across battlefields like unstoppable juggernauts, Edward had been quietly revolutionizing his army. He'd learned harsh lessons from previous campaigns, and he wasn't about to repeat the mistakes of his predecessors. The English army was built around something quite revolutionary for its time, the longbow. Now you might think, what's so special about a bow? But these weren't ordinary bows. English longbows were over 6 feet tall, could shoot arrows 300 yards with deadly accuracy, and required such strength to draw that archers trained from childhood. A skilled English archer could loose 12 arrows per minute. Imagine facing that rate of fire when your only protection is heavy armor that actually slows you down. But here's the kicker, and this is where our story takes a turn toward the future. Edward brought along something that had never been seen on a major European battlefield before: cannons. These weren't the massive siege guns we might imagine today. They were crude, primitive things called ribalds or pots de fer, literally iron pots. They looked more like oversized metal tubes than the artillery we know from later centuries. These early cannons were wildly inaccurate, difficult to reload, and frankly, not much more effective than a good catapult in terms of actual damage. But, and this is crucial, they made a sound unlike anything anyone had ever heard in battle. The thunderous roar, the flash of fire, the acrid smoke that billowed across the field. It was like witnessing sorcery. Meanwhile, Philip VI was marching north with what he considered the finest army in Europe. Picture the flower of French nobility, knights whose families had been perfecting the art of mounted warfare for generations. These men were walking fortresses, encased in the best armor money could buy, riding the finest war horses, carrying lances and swords forged by master craftsmen. They represented everything that medieval warfare was supposed to be about: honor, courage, and the divine right of nobility to dominate the battlefield. Philip's army was massive compared to Edward's. Estimates suggest he had anywhere from 25 to 30,000 men, including thousands of these elite knights. In the medieval mindset, numbers and nobility should have guaranteed victory. After all, what could a bunch of common English archers possibly do against the cream of French chivalry? The two armies were like representatives of different eras meeting on the same battlefield. On one side, you had tradition, honor, and the established order of medieval society. On the other, you had innovation, pragmatism, and a willingness to embrace new technology, no matter how crude it might seem. As both armies converged on the small village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu, neither side fully understood that they were about to participate in one of history's great turning points. Edward probably knew his new weapons might give him an edge, but even he couldn't have predicted just how dramatically this single battle would echo through the centuries. The stage was set for a collision between past and future, between the age of chivalry and the dawn of gunpowder warfare. In just a few hours, the medieval world would discover that tradition and nobility meant nothing when faced with cold, calculated innovation and the terrible efficiency of new technology. What happened next would send shockwaves through every royal court in Europe. and marked the beginning of the end for an entire way of life that had dominated warfare for centuries. Imagine you're Edward III, and you've just spent weeks tearing through the French countryside like a whirlwind of destruction. Your army has burned villages, captured towns, and filled their pockets with French gold. But now, as summer reaches its peak in 1346, you're facing a problem that could spell disaster for everything you've worked for. You see, Edward's campaign had started brilliantly. He'd landed in Normandy and proceeded to do what medieval armies did best: live off the land while making life miserable for his enemies. This wasn't just random destruction, though. Edward was playing a much deeper game. He knew that every burned field and captured town would force Philip VI to respond. It was like poking a sleeping giant with a very sharp stick, and respond Philip did. The French king couldn't just sit in Paris while an English army rampaged through his territory, burning and looting as they pleased. His nobles were furious, his people were suffering, and his reputation as a king was on the line. So Philip gathered the largest army France had seen in years and began the pursuit. Here's where things get really interesting. Edward found himself in the position that every military commander dreads, being chased by a force nearly twice the size of his own, running low on supplies, and getting further from friendly territory with each passing day. His men were tired, their horses were worn out, and every step north took them deeper into hostile country. But Edward wasn't panicking. Remember, this was a king who'd been studying warfare his entire life, and he'd learned some harsh lessons from England's earlier defeats in Scotland and France. He knew that sometimes the best strategy isn't to keep running. Sometimes you have to turn around and fight, but only on your own terms. The key was finding the right spot. In medieval warfare, choosing your battlefield was often more important than the size of your army or the quality of your weapons. Edward needed a place where Philip's numerical advantage would work against him, where those thousands of French knights couldn't simply overwhelm the English through sheer force. As his army moved through the countryside near the small village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu, Edward's experienced eye spotted something that made him stop and smile. There, rising gently from the surrounding farmland, was a hill that seemed designed by the gods of war themselves for exactly the kind of fight he had in mind. The hill wasn't particularly high or dramatic. We're not talking about some towering mountain fortress here, but it had everything Edward needed. The slope was just steep enough to make charging cavalry work harder while giving his archers a perfect elevated position. The ground was firm and dry, which meant his men could move freely while enemy horses would struggle in the uphill charge. But here's the brilliant part, and this shows you just how clever Edward really was. The hill had a natural funnel shape that would force attacking armies to bunch up as they climbed. Instead of being able to spread out and use their numbers effectively, Philip's knights would be squeezed together, making perfect targets for English arrows raining down from above. Edward also noticed something else that would prove crucial. The prevailing wind was blowing from behind the English position toward where the French would have to attack. This might seem like a tiny detail, but for archers, wind direction could mean the difference between victory and defeat. With the wind at their backs, English arrows would fly further and hit harder. Meanwhile, if the French had any archers of their own, they'd be shooting into a headwind. The more Edward studied this position, the more he realized he'd found something special. This wasn't just a good defensive position. It was a trap waiting to be sprung. All he had to do was convince Philip to walk into it. So Edward made one of the boldest decisions in military history. Instead of continuing to run from an army twice his size, he ordered his men to stop, dig in, and prepare for battle. His knights and nobles probably thought he'd lost his mind. Here they were, outnumbered, exhausted, and far from home, and their king wanted to pick a fight with the most powerful army in Europe. But Edward had done his calculations. He'd studied the ground, analyzed his enemy's weaknesses, and concluded that this hilltop near Crécy offered him something he couldn't get anywhere else: the chance to force Philip to fight on English terms rather than French ones. As word spread through the English camp that they were making a stand, you can imagine the mix of emotions. Some men were probably relieved. Running for your life gets exhausting after a while, and at least now they'd have a chance to fight back. Others were terrified, knowing they'd soon face the finest heavy cavalry in Europe with nowhere left to retreat. Edward spent that evening walking among his men, talking to them, reassuring them, and explaining his plan. He knew that morale would be everything in the coming battle. His soldiers needed to believe that their king had a strategy that could overcome impossible odds. Meanwhile, Philip's massive army was approaching fast, and the French king was probably feeling pretty confident. After weeks of chasing these English raiders, he finally had them cornered. Tomorrow, he would crush Edward's little army and end this rebellion once and for all. Neither king could have predicted that this little hill near a forgotten French village was about to become the stage for one of history's most revolutionary battles. A fight that would prove once and for all that in warfare, brains often beat brawn, and innovation trumps tradition every single time. Let me tell you about three men whose choices on a single day would echo through centuries. Each carried the weight of their kingdom's future on their shoulders, but they couldn't have been more different in how they approached the art of war. Edward wasn't your typical medieval king. While most rulers of his time were content to follow the same playbook their fathers and grandfathers had used, Edward was always asking uncomfortable questions. Why should knights be the only ones who mattered in battle? Why couldn't common soldiers with the right training and equipment defeat noble cavalry? What if there were better ways to fight wars? Born in 1312, Edward had watched his father struggle with military disasters in Scotland. He'd seen English armies crushed by enemies who refused to fight by traditional rules. Those painful lessons shaped him into something rare for his era. A king willing to embrace innovation, even if it meant abandoning centuries of military tradition. Here's what made Edward truly dangerous. He understood that warfare was changing, and he wasn't afraid to change with it. While other kings still believed that a noble knight on horseback was worth 10 common foot soldiers, Edward had done the math differently. He'd discovered that a well-trained archer could bring down that same knight from 300 yards away, and it cost a fraction of the price to train and equip him. Edward's genius lay in recognizing potential where others saw only peasants. He took English farmers and woodsmen, men who'd grown up hunting with bows to put food on their tables, and turned them into the most feared military force in Europe. These weren't just random soldiers with weapons. They were specialists who could put an arrow through a coin at incredible distances. But perhaps most remarkably, Edward was willing to experiment with weapons that even his own nobles thought were beneath the dignity of proper warfare. Those primitive cannons he brought to Crécy, many of his knights probably grumbled that such devices were cowardly, unworthy of honorable combat. Edward didn't care about honor in the traditional sense. He cared about winning. Now picture Philip VI, and you'll see a man trapped by the very system that had made France powerful. Philip wasn't a bad king or a poor military leader. Quite the opposite. He was everything medieval society expected a ruler to be: noble, brave, and utterly committed to the chivalric ideals that had dominated European warfare for centuries. Philip had inherited not just a throne, but an entire worldview. In his mind, warfare was about honor, courage, and the natural superiority of noble blood. Knights weren't just soldiers. They were the very foundation of society, the guardians of civilization, the men chosen by God to protect the weak and uphold justice. This belief system had served France well for generations. French heavy cavalry had dominated battlefields across Europe, crushing enemies through sheer force and superior training. When Philip looked at his army, he saw the finest military machine in the world. Thousands of knights whose families had been perfecting the art of mounted combat for centuries. But here's the tragedy of Philip's story. His greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. He was so convinced of the superiority of traditional warfare that he couldn't see how the world was changing around him. When his advisors told him about Edward's archers and strange new weapons, Philip probably dismissed such concerns. How could common peasants with bows possibly threaten the flower of French nobility? Philip's confidence wasn't entirely misplaced. His knights really were magnificent warriors, trained from childhood in the arts of war, equipped with the finest armor and weapons money could buy. In a traditional medieval battle, they should have swept the English from the field without breaking a sweat. Then there's Edward of Woodstock, known to history as the Black Prince, though that name wouldn't come until much later. Imagine being 16 years old and knowing that tomorrow you'll face your first real battle. Not some tournament or training exercise, but actual life-or-death combat where men will try to kill you. The Black Prince wasn't just any 16-year-old, of course. He was the heir to the English throne, raised from birth to be a warrior king like his father. But there's a world of difference between practicing with wooden swords in the safety of a castle courtyard and facing real French knights who want to see your blood on their blades. What makes the Black Prince's story so compelling is that Crécy would be his baptism by fire. His father had deliberately brought him on this campaign to learn the realities of war, but Edward III probably never imagined his son would face such a massive battle so early in his military career. The young prince commanded the right wing of the English army, a position of enormous responsibility for someone who could barely grow a proper beard. His father was essentially saying, "Here's a third of our army, son. Try not to get everyone killed." The pressure must have been incredible. But here's what's fascinating about the Black Prince. He represented the perfect fusion of old and new. He had all the noble breeding and chivalric training that Philip's knights respected, but he'd also grown up watching his father revolutionize English warfare. He understood both the honor of knighthood and the brutal efficiency of longbows and cannons. What you had at Crécy was more than just two armies preparing to fight. You had two completely different philosophies about how wars should be won, colliding head-on. Edward represented pragmatic innovation, the willingness to use whatever worked regardless of tradition. Philip embodied noble tradition, the belief that there were right and wrong ways to fight, and that honor mattered more than mere victory. The Black Prince stood between these two worlds, old enough to understand the stakes but young enough to adapt to whatever the battle might demand. His performance at Crécy would determine not just his own future, but potentially the fate of English ambitions in France. As the sun set on August 25th, 1346, these three men made their final preparations for a battle that would test everything they believed about war, honor, and the price of victory. None of them could have predicted that by the next evening, the entire medieval world would be forced to reconsider everything it thought it knew about how battles should be fought. Picture this moment if you can. It's late afternoon on August 26th, 1346, and the world is about to change forever. The French army has spent hours getting into position, their magnificent knights gleaming in the summer sun like something out of a fairy tale. Thousands of them, the finest warriors Europe has ever produced, sitting astride horses that cost more than most people would see in a lifetime. Philip VI looks across the field at Edward's much smaller force positioned on that gentle slope, and he probably feels a surge of confidence. This is what French knights were born to do: charge across open ground and sweep away their enemies like leaves before a storm. It's worked for centuries, after all. Why should today be any different? But here's where our story takes its first dramatic turn. Edward had positioned his men with the precision of a master chess player. His longbowmen were arranged in a formation that medieval chroniclers would later call harrow teeth, angled wedges that could pour arrows into any attacking force from multiple directions. Behind them, almost hidden from French view, were those strange metal tubes that most people had never seen before. The French charge began like something out of legend. Imagine the sound: thousands of hoofbeats thundering across the earth, the jingle of mail armor, the proud banners snapping in the wind. These weren't just soldiers. They were the cream of French nobility, men whose families had been warriors since the time of Charlemagne. They rode forward with absolute confidence, probably thinking this would be over in minutes. Then came the arrows. Now, if you've never seen what a longbow can really do, it's hard to imagine the sheer terror of facing 5,000 of them at once. These weren't the little hunting bows you might see at a modern archery range. English longbows were 6-foot-tall monsters that required so much strength to draw that archers developed distinctively enlarged left arms from years of training. The arrows they shot weren't just sharp. They were specifically designed to punch through the finest armor money could buy. The sky literally darkened. Contemporary chroniclers weren't exaggerating when they wrote about arrows blotting out the sun. Imagine looking up and seeing thousands of yard-long shafts arcing through the air toward you, each one capable of killing a man or dropping a horse. The sound alone must have been terrifying, a whistling crescendo that grew louder and louder, until death rained down from above. What happened next was carnage on a scale that shocked even hardened medieval warriors. Horses screamed and fell, their riders pinned beneath them. Knights who had survived the arrow storm found themselves trapped in heavy armor, struggling to get back on their feet while more waves of arrows poured down. The proud French charge dissolved into chaos as wounded horses bolted in terror, carrying their riders away from the battle or trampling fallen comrades. But then something happened that no one on that battlefield could have prepared for. From the English lines came a sound unlike anything human ears had ever heard in battle. A deep, earth-shaking boom that seemed to come from the very bowels of hell itself. Then another, and another. The primitive cannons Edward had brought to Crécy were speaking for the first time in a major European battle. Now, let's be honest about these early cannons. They weren't the massive siege guns we might imagine from later centuries. They were crude, unreliable things that probably killed as many of their own operators as they did enemies. They fired irregularly, took forever to reload, and their accuracy was laughable. In terms of actual military effectiveness, they were probably less useful than a good catapult. But effectiveness wasn't the point. It was the psychological impact that mattered. Try to put yourself in the boots of a French knight for a moment. You've trained your entire life for warfare, but everything you know is based on steel, muscle, and courage. You understand arrows. They've been part of warfare for centuries. You know how to face cavalry charges, siege engines, even Greek fire. But this was something entirely outside human experience. The sound was like thunder, but thunder that came from the earth instead of the sky. The flash of fire and the billowing smoke looked like sorcery, and the smell, that acrid, sulfurous stench of burning gunpowder, was unlike anything anyone had ever encountered on a battlefield. Horses that had been trained to charge into battle without flinching suddenly reared in terror. These were animals bred for war, but their instincts were screaming that this wasn't natural. Men who had faced death a dozen times found themselves shaking, not from cowardice but from a primal fear of the unknown. The French knights began to panic, and panic on a medieval battlefield was contagious. Horses crashed into each other as their riders lost control. Men who should have been thinking about combat strategy were instead wondering if they were facing demons or witchcraft. The carefully organized charge dissolved into a terrified mob. But here's the most tragic part of the story. The French kept trying. These were brave men after all, raised from birth to believe that courage and honor could overcome any obstacle. Even as their comrades fell around them, even as these strange new weapons roared and flashed, they kept pushing forward. Their code of chivalry simply wouldn't let them retreat, even when retreat might have been the wisest choice. Wave after wave of French knights struggled up that hill, each group hoping to succeed where the previous one had failed. They came in their hundreds, their armor glinting in the afternoon sun, their war cries echoing across the field. And each time the English arrows cut them down while those mysterious thundermakers added their own terrifying voice to the slaughter. The battlefield became littered with the flower of French nobility. Men whose names were known throughout Europe, whose families had served kings for generations, lay dead or dying in the mud of a small French village. Horses that had cost fortunes lay still beside their masters, their magnificent training useless against weapons they couldn't understand. What made it even more devastating was the way the battle challenged everything medieval society believed about warfare. For centuries, the message had been clear. Noble birth, expensive training, and fine equipment would always triumph over common soldiers with simple weapons. Crécy shattered that belief in the space of a few hours. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, it became clear that something fundamental had changed. The age of the knight wasn't over yet. That would take time. But the first cracks in their dominance were spreading across the battlefield like spider webs in broken glass. The future of warfare had announced itself with thunder and flame, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. Sometimes the greatest truths about history aren't found in the grand strategies of kings or the movements of armies, but in the beating hearts of individual soldiers facing their darkest hour. Let me tell you about two men whose paths crossed on that blood-soaked hill at Crécy, each carrying the weight of his entire world on his shoulders. Thomas wasn't supposed to be a hero. Back home in Yorkshire, he was just another farmer's son who happened to be good with a bow. Maybe he'd started hunting rabbits to help feed his family, Or perhaps he'd shown promise at the village archery contests that were as much a part of English life as Sunday church services. Either way, when King Edward's recruiters came through his village looking for men with steady hands and sharp eyes, Thomas found himself marching off to war. Picture him now, standing on that hillside at Crécy, his fingers raw and bleeding from hours of drawing his bowstring. Each pull of that massive longbow required the strength of a man's entire body. Shoulders, back, arms, and core all working together to bend 6 feet of seasoned yew. After shooting arrow after arrow into the charging French ranks, Thomas's hands were a mess of torn calluses and fresh cuts. But Thomas couldn't stop. Every time he thought the French charges were finished, another wave of knights would crest the hill, their armor gleaming despite the blood and mud. His quiver was running low, and he'd already scavenged arrows from fallen comrades. The smell of blood and gunpowder filled his nostrils, and his ears rang from the constant thunder of those strange new cannons behind him. Here's what made Thomas's story so remarkable. He was fighting for something bigger than himself, even if he couldn't fully understand what that was. This wasn't his war in the traditional sense. He had no claim to French lands, no noble grievances to settle. But he was part of something revolutionary, a new kind of army where common men could stand toe-to-toe with the greatest knights in Europe and emerge victorious. Thomas probably didn't think of himself as making history. He was just trying to stay alive, to do his job, to not let down the men standing beside him. But with every arrow he loosed, he was helping to write the death certificate of medieval warfare as the world had known it. The irony wasn't lost on him, though. Here he was, a farmer's son, killing men who wore more wealth on their bodies than his entire village would see in a year. These French knights weren't just soldiers. They were walking treasures. Their armor crafted by master smiths, their weapons passed down through generations of noble families. And Thomas was bringing them down with arrows that cost a few pennies each. Now let me tell you about Sir Geoffroy de Charny, a man who embodied everything that medieval knighthood was supposed to represent. Geoffroy wasn't just any French knight. He was one of the most respected warriors in all of Europe, a man who had literally written the book on chivalric behavior. His treatise on knighthood was studied by nobles across the continent, and his reputation for honor and courage was legendary. But here's the tragedy of Geoffroy's story. He was fighting for a world that was already dying, even if he didn't know it yet. Geoffroy had grown up believing that warfare was about honor, courage, and the divine right of nobility to protect the weak. In his mind, knights weren't just soldiers. They were God's chosen warriors, men elevated above common folk by their noble blood and sacred oaths. The very idea that peasants with bows could threaten such divinely ordained authority was not just militarily impossible, it was morally wrong. When Geoffroy looked across the battlefield at Crécy, he saw something that offended his very soul. English commoners were killing French nobles, and they were doing it with weapons that required no honor, no face-to-face courage, no personal risk. From his perspective, this wasn't warfare, it was murder from a distance, cowardly and dishonorable. But Geoffroy's code wouldn't let him retreat. Even as he watched wave after wave of his fellow knights cut down by English arrows, even as those mysterious thunder weapons added their own terrifying voice to the slaughter, he knew he had to charge. Not because he thought he could win. By this point, even the bravest knight could see how the battle was going. But because honor demanded it. Think about the courage that required. Geoffroy wasn't stupid or blind. He could see the bodies of his comrades littering the hillside, could hear the screams of wounded horses and dying men. He knew that riding up that slope meant almost certain death. But in his world, there were things worse than death: dishonor, cowardice, the failure to live up to the ideals that had shaped his entire life. So Geoffroy spurred his horse forward one last time, his lance lowered, his banner streaming behind him. He rode not for victory, but for the very soul of everything he believed in. His charge was as much a funeral march as a military maneuver, the death song of an entire way of life. The beautiful and terrible thing about Crécy was how it brought these two worlds together in the most brutal way possible. Thomas, the English yeoman, represented the future, common soldiers using new technologies to challenge the established order. Geoffroy, the French knight, embodied the past, noble warriors clinging to ancient ideals even as those ideals led them to destruction. Neither man was evil or wrong in his own context. Thomas was a good soldier doing his duty, using the skills he'd been taught to protect his king and his comrades. Geoffroy was an honorable knight, living by a code that had guided his class for centuries, but history had put them on opposite sides of a revolution, and only one worldview could survive. As Thomas drew his bowstring one more time, his bleeding fingers steady despite the pain, he probably didn't think about the knight charging toward him as a person with hopes and fears and a family waiting at home. Geoffroy was just another target, another threat to be eliminated. The distance between them, 300 yards of killing ground, made it easier to see enemies rather than fellow human beings. But that distance was more than just physical space. It represented the gap between two entire eras of human history, the chasm between the medieval world and the modern age that was struggling to be born. Thomas's arrows were messengers from the future, carrying news that the age of knights was ending. Geoffroy's charge was a letter from the past, written in blood and courage and stubborn refusal to accept that the world had changed. When Thomas's arrow found its mark, it wasn't just Sir Geoffroy de Charny who fell. It was an entire vision of how the world should work, a 1,000-year-old dream of noble warriors and honorable combat. And when Geoffroy's body hit the ground, it landed in a world that was already different from the one he'd known when he first climbed into his saddle that morning. The battle would end, the dead would be buried, and the survivors would go home to tell their stories. But the real story of Crécy wasn't about tactics or technology or even victory and defeat. It was about two men, one bleeding from his bowstring, the other dying for his ideals, who found themselves on the front lines of history's most unforgiving battle, the war between past and future. As darkness fell over the battlefield at Crécy, an eerie silence replaced the thunder of hooves and the screams of dying men. The field that had been green farmland that morning was now carpeted with bodies, French banners trampled into the mud, and the dreams of an entire generation of knights buried beneath the weight of a revolution they never saw coming. Picture Edward III walking among his exhausted soldiers as the last light faded from the sky. His gamble had paid off beyond his wildest expectations, but even victory on this scale came with a sobering reality. The field before him wasn't just littered with enemy dead, it was scattered with the remnants of a worldview that had dominated Europe for centuries. The numbers tell only part of the story. Conservative estimates suggest that over 1,500 French nobles died that day, including 11 princes, 80 bannerets, and 1,200 knights. But these weren't just statistics, they were the cream of French society, men whose families had served the crown for generations, whose deaths would leave gaping holes in the fabric of the kingdom. Among all these fallen warriors, one death stood out as particularly tragic and symbolic. King John of Bohemia, blind for nearly a decade but still burning with the warrior spirit that had made him legendary across Europe, had insisted on joining the charge despite his disability. At 50 years old, John could no longer see his enemies, but his sense of honor wouldn't let him retreat from battle. Here's where John's story becomes both heartbreaking and magnificent. Knowing he couldn't fight effectively while blind, he came up with a solution that was either brilliant or completely mad, depending on how you look at it. He ordered his knights to tie their horses' reins to his own, creating a human chain that would carry him into the heart of battle. If he was going to die, he would die as a king should, sword in hand, charging toward his enemies. The sight of this blind king, flanked by his loyal knights, riding steadily up that deadly hillside, must have been one of the most remarkable moments in the entire battle. John couldn't see the English archers drawing their bows, couldn't witness the carnage around him, but he rode forward anyway, guided only by the sound of battle and his unshakable belief that honor mattered more than life itself. When the English arrows found their mark, John and his companions fell together, still bound by the ropes that had carried them to their doom. It was a death that belonged more to legend than to real life, and yet it happened on that muddy field in France, witnessed by thousands of men who would carry the story to their graves. John's death became a symbol of everything Crécy represented. Here was a king who embodied all the virtues medieval society held dear: courage, honor, loyalty, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. But those very virtues, magnificent as they were, had led him straight into the path of English arrows, shot by men who didn't care about his royal blood or his noble intentions. The French survivors who managed to escape the battlefield that night carried more than just physical wounds. They bore the psychological trauma of watching their entire world collapse in a single afternoon. These were men who had grown up believing that noble birth and knightly training made them virtually invincible against common soldiers. Now, they had to somehow make sense of a reality where peasants with bows could slaughter the finest warriors in Europe. Philip VI himself had narrowly escaped death. His horse shot out from under him during one of the charges. Imagine the humiliation of a king who had brought the largest army France had seen in years, only to watch it destroyed by a force half its size. Philip had to retreat not just from a battlefield, but from everything he thought he knew about warfare and leadership. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the aftermath wasn't the immediate casualties. It was the realization of what those deaths meant for the future. The men who died at Crécy weren't just soldiers. They were fathers, brothers, and sons who would never return home. They were the next generation of French leadership, the nobles who should have guided the kingdom through the challenging decades ahead. French villages across the country would spend the coming weeks and months receiving the worst possible news. Messages would arrive telling families that their sons, husbands, and fathers had fallen in a distant field, killed not in some glorious single combat, but cut down by arrows shot by men they never saw. The very randomness of it made the deaths seem even more cruel. Meanwhile, the English soldiers were experiencing their own form of shock, though theirs came from victory rather than defeat. Many of these men were common farmers and craftsmen who had never imagined they could defeat the legendary French knights. Now they found themselves standing over the bodies of some of the most famous warriors in Europe, men whose names they'd heard in songs and stories since childhood. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. The French had to grapple with the collapse of their military superiority and the deaths of so many nobles that the kingdom's entire power structure was shaken. The English, on the other hand, had to process the reality that they had just changed the course of European history with their longbows and primitive cannons. As dawn broke over Crécy the next morning, the full scope of the disaster became clear. The battlefield looked like a graveyard for chivalry itself. French armor, once symbols of invincibility, lay scattered and pierced. Banners that had flown proudly over a dozen victories now served as shrouds for their bearers. The very ground seemed to groan under the weight of broken dreams and shattered certainties. Word of the catastrophe spread across Europe like wildfire. In royal courts from London to Vienna, nobles struggled to understand how such a thing could have happened. The French army hadn't just lost a battle. It had been annihilated by forces that traditional military thinking said should have been helpless against heavy cavalry. The ripple effects would be felt for generations. French military doctrine would have to be completely rethought. The English, emboldened by their success, would continue to refine their new style of warfare. And across Europe, other rulers would begin to wonder if their own knights might be just as vulnerable to these new weapons and tactics. But beyond all the political and military consequences, Crécy represented something deeper, the end of an age when birth and breeding guaranteed success on the battlefield. The dead knights scattered across that French hillside had been raised from childhood to believe they were superior warriors blessed by God and birth. Their deaths proved that in the new world being born, skill and innovation mattered more than noble blood. The sun that set over Crécy on August 26, 1346, marked the end of more than just a single day. It was the twilight of the age of chivalry, the closing of a chapter in human history that would never be written again. Sometimes a single day can split history in two, creating a clear line between what came before and what comes after. Crécy was one of those days, a moment when the medieval world looked into the face of the future and saw its own reflection fading away like candlelight at dawn. The legacy of Crécy wasn't just about who won or lost that particular battle. It was about what that victory meant for every kingdom, every army, and every soldier who would follow. Those primitive cannons that had roared across the French countryside carried a message that would echo through the centuries. The age of individual heroism was giving way to the age of technology and mass firepower. Within months of Crécy, Military minds across Europe were frantically trying to understand what they had witnessed. Reports of the battle spread like wildfire through royal courts, and the message was both clear and terrifying. Everything they thought they knew about warfare was wrong. Picture the conversations happening in castles from England to Hungary. Veteran knights who had spent their entire lives perfecting the art of mounted combat suddenly found themselves questioning whether their skills had any value at all. If the finest French cavalry in Europe could be destroyed by English peasants with bows and some crude metal tubes, what did that mean for the future of knighthood? The smart rulers started adapting immediately. Within a decade of Crécy, armies across Europe were experimenting with their own artillery. These early cannons were still crude and unreliable. They exploded as often as they fired properly, and their accuracy was laughable by modern standards. But every king and general understood that they couldn't afford to ignore this new technology. Here's what made the change so revolutionary. For the first time in centuries, victory in battle depended more on engineering and logistics than on individual courage and skill. The knight who had spent 20 years perfecting his swordplay was now less valuable than the craftsman who could build a cannon, or the gunner who knew how to load and fire it safely. Crécy proved something that medieval society had always feared, but never wanted to admit, that common soldiers, properly trained and equipped, could defeat the noble elite. This wasn't just a military revolution, it was a social earthquake that shook the very foundations of European society. Think about what this meant for the average person living in the 14th century. For generations, their ancestors had accepted that nobles were their natural superiors, chosen by God and birth to rule over them. The entire social order was built on the idea that some people were simply born better than others, destined to be warriors and leaders while everyone else remained peasants and servants. But Crécy shattered that illusion. Those English archers who had brought down French knights weren't nobles. They were farmers, craftsmen, and laborers who had learned to use their weapons through practice rather than breeding. If a blacksmith's son could kill a duke with a well-aimed arrow, what did that say about the divine right of nobility? The psychological impact of this realization rippled through European society for generations. Suddenly, rulers had to worry not just about other nobles challenging their authority, but about their own common subjects. If peasants could master weapons that made them dangerous to knights, how long before they started questioning other aspects of the social order? The cannons at Crécy were just the beginning. Within 50 years, artillery had evolved from crude experimental weapons into sophisticated engines of war that could knock down castle walls and decide the fate of kingdoms. The technological revolution that began on that French hillside would eventually transform every aspect of human conflict. By the early 1400s, cannons were no longer curiosities brought along to frighten horses. They were essential military equipment that no serious army could do without. The Ottoman Empire used massive cannons to breach the supposedly impregnable walls of Constantinople in 1453. The French employed artillery to recapture English-held territories during the final phases of the 100 Years' War. Even the Swiss, famous for their disciplined infantry, began incorporating firearms into their military formations. But here's the fascinating part. The spread of gunpowder weapons created a feedback loop that accelerated military innovation. Each improvement in artillery led to improvements in defensive architecture. Each new type of cannon prompted the development of new tactics to counter it. The pace of military change, which had been glacially slow throughout the medieval period, suddenly accelerated to a breakneck speed. One of the most visible impacts of the Gunpowder Revolution was what it did to medieval fortifications. Those massive stone castles that had dominated European landscapes for centuries suddenly became obsolete almost overnight. Walls that could withstand months of siege warfare using traditional methods could be reduced to rubble in days by well-placed artillery. This wasn't just a military problem. It was an economic and social catastrophe for the noble class. Castles weren't just military installations. They were symbols of power, centers of administration, and the physical embodiment of feudal authority. When artillery made castle walls worthless, it undermined the entire system that had kept nobles in power for generations. The response was swift and expensive. Across Europe, Rulers began tearing down their medieval fortifications and replacing them with new designs specifically built to withstand cannon fire. These new fortresses, with their low, thick walls and angular bastions, looked nothing like the soaring towers and dramatic battlements of medieval castles. They were purely functional, designed by engineers rather than architects, built for survival rather than display. Perhaps the most important long-term consequence of Crécy was how it changed the nature of military service itself. The old feudal system, where nobles brought their own knights and retainers to serve their king for limited periods, simply couldn't adapt to the new realities of gunpowder warfare. Operating artillery required specialized knowledge and constant practice. You couldn't just hand a cannon to a knight and expect him to figure it out. These weapons needed professional soldiers who dedicated their entire careers to mastering the new technology. This meant paying them regularly, training them constantly, and keeping them in service year-round, rather than just during campaign seasons. The result was the birth of standing armies, permanent military forces maintained by the state rather than assembled temporarily from feudal levies. These professional soldiers weren't fighting for honor or feudal obligation. They were fighting for pay, which meant they could be deployed whenever and wherever their rulers needed them. If you fast forward through history from Crécy to the great battles of later centuries, Waterloo, Gettysburg, the Somme, you can trace a direct line of development that started with those primitive cannons on that French hillside. Every major military innovation that followed built on the lessons learned that day, that technology trumps tradition, that disciplined common soldiers can defeat elite warriors, and that the side with better weapons usually wins. The longbows that dominated Crécy gave way to muskets, which evolved into rifles which led to machine guns, and eventually to all the sophisticated weapon systems of modern warfare. The psychological warfare pioneered by those early cannons developed into the devastating artillery barrages of the First World War and beyond. But the legacy of Crécy extends far beyond military history. That battle marked the beginning of a fundamental shift in how power was distributed in European society. The rise of gunpowder weapons meant that success in war depended increasingly on a kingdom's ability to manufacture, transport, and deploy complex technology, rather than on the personal courage of its nobles. This gave enormous advantages to centralized states with strong economies and efficient administrations. Kingdoms that could afford to equip and train professional armies started dominating those that still relied on feudal levies. The balance of power shifted from scattered noble strongholds to centralized royal governments that could coordinate large-scale military operations. The world that emerged from this transformation would have been almost unrecognizable to the knights who charged up that hill at Crécy. Within a few centuries, the descendants of those English archers would be carrying muskets across the battlefields of Europe and the Americas, while the successors to those French cannons would be reshaping coastlines and toppling empires. The thunder that first rolled across the fields of Crécy on August 26, 1346, never really stopped echoing. It just grew louder and more complex, eventually becoming the soundtrack of the modern world. Every time we hear the roar of artillery, the crack of rifle fire, or even the sonic boom of a jet aircraft, we're listening to distant echoes of that revolutionary moment when technology first announced its intention to reshape human civilization. The age of knights ended that day, but the age of innovation had just begun. As we reach the end of our journey back to that fateful day in 1346, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on why this battle still matters nearly 700 years later. The story of Crécy isn't just about medieval knights and primitive cannons. It's about something much deeper and more enduring that speaks to the human condition itself. Edward III probably didn't realize it when he positioned those crude cannons on the hillside at Crécy, but he was firing the opening shot of a revolution that would reshape not just warfare, but the entire course of human history. Those primitive metal tubes, belching smoke and flame across a French battlefield, were delivering a message that would echo through the centuries: adapt or perish. The warning wasn't just meant for French knights, though they paid the highest price for ignoring it. It was a message for anyone, anywhere, who become so comfortable with the way things have always been done that they forget the world never stops changing. The nobles who died at Crécy weren't evil or stupid. They were simply trapped by their own success, prisoners of a system that had worked so well for so long that they couldn't imagine it ever failing. Think about how many times throughout history we've seen the same pattern repeat itself. Powerful empires that become complacent and fall to hungrier, more innovative enemies. Industries that dominated for decades only to be swept away by new technologies they refused to take seriously. Even in our own time, we've watched giant corporations crumble because they couldn't adapt to changing markets or new ways of doing business. Crécy teaches us that no advantage lasts forever, no matter how overwhelming it might seem. The French knights who rode across Europe for centuries, crushing all opposition, probably thought their dominance was as permanent as the mountains. But permanence is an illusion. The only constant in human affairs is change itself. Here's something fascinating about the legacy of Crécy. While it marked the beginning of the end for one way of life, it also revealed timeless truths about human nature that remain just as relevant today. The battle showcased both humanity's incredible capacity for innovation and our equally powerful tendency to cling to the familiar, even when it's killing us. Edward's willingness to embrace new technology, even when it seemed crude and unreliable, demonstrates the kind of adaptability that has always driven human progress. He wasn't attached to romantic notions about how warfare should be conducted. He was focused on what actually worked. That pragmatic approach to problem-solving is what allowed a small English army to defeat a much larger French force. But the French response at Crécy shows us something equally important about human nature. Those knights who kept charging up that hill, wave after wave, weren't just being stubborn or foolish. They were defending something they believed in so deeply that they were willing to die for it, a code of honor that gave their lives meaning and structure. In some ways, both sides were right. Edward was correct that innovation and adaptability are essential for survival in a changing world. But the French knights were also right that some things are worth preserving, even at great cost. The tragedy of Crécy wasn't that people died. People die in every war. The tragedy was that two valid but incompatible worldviews collided with such devastating force. The battlefield at Crécy teaches us several lessons that remain painfully relevant today. First, that pride can be the most dangerous enemy of all. The French army that marched toward that English position wasn't just confident, it was arrogant, convinced that noble birth and traditional methods would always triumph over innovation and common sense. But here's the subtle part. Edward's victory could have made the English just as arrogant, just as vulnerable to the next military revolution. The real lesson isn't that the English were inherently superior to the French, but that success in any era requires humility, curiosity, and a willingness to question your own assumptions. Crécy also reminds us that technological change always comes with a human cost. Those cannons that announced the dawn of the Gunpowder Age didn't just make warfare more efficient, they made it more impersonal, more brutal, and ultimately more deadly. The knight who died in single combat at least had a chance to demonstrate his skill and courage. The soldier killed by an arrow shot from 300 yards away, or later by a bullet fired by someone he never saw, had no such opportunity. This is the paradox of progress. Every advance that makes life easier or more efficient also tends to make it more complex and often more dangerous. The same innovations that can solve old problems almost always create new ones. The cannons that helped end the Age of Knights also began an arms race that continues to this day. But perhaps the most important lesson from Crécy is that behind every great historical moment are individual human beings making difficult choices under enormous pressure. Thomas the Archer bleeding from his bowstring, choosing to keep fighting even as his fingers were torn raw. Sir Geoffroy de Charny, riding towards certain death because his code of honor demanded it. King John of Bohemia, blind and aging, insisting on one last charge because he couldn't bear to die in bed. These weren't abstract historical forces colliding. They were real people with hopes, fears, families, and dreams, caught up in events larger than themselves. The fact that we can still feel the weight of their choices, still understand the dilemmas they faced, reminds us that the fundamental challenges of human existence haven't changed all that much since 1346. We may not face charging knights or primitive cannons, but we all face moments when we have to choose between the comfort of tradition and the uncertainty of change. We all struggle with the balance between innovation and preservation, between pragmatism and principle. The men who fought at Crécy were dealing with the same basic questions that still confront us today. How do we adapt to a changing world without losing the things that matter most? How do we embrace progress without sacrificing our humanity? This is why the story of Crécy continues to resonate across the centuries. It's not just a tale of medieval warfare or technological innovation. It's a mirror that reflects our own struggles with change, adaptation, and the price of progress. The battles we fight today may be different in their details, but they're driven by the same fundamental forces that shaped events on that French hillside nearly 700 years ago. The thunder of those primitive cannons at Crécy was indeed the sound of the future announcing itself to the past. But it was also something more. It was the sound of human beings grappling with the eternal challenge of how to live, how to change, and how to preserve what matters in a world that never stops moving. When we study history, we're not just learning about dead people and forgotten events. We're discovering the deep patterns that connect their struggles to our own, the timeless truths that emerge from the collision of human ambition and human limitation. The past isn't just dates and dust. It's a living conversation between then and now, a dialogue between their choices and ours. The men who fought at Crécy couldn't have imagined the world we live in today, with its smartphones and satellites, its global economy and instant communication. But they would have recognized the fundamental challenges we face. How do we balance tradition with innovation? How do we preserve what's valuable while embracing necessary change? How do we maintain our humanity in the face of technological transformation? These are the questions that made Crécy more than just another medieval battle. They're the questions that make its story eternal, as relevant today as it was when the first chroniclers sat down to record what had happened on that blood-soaked hill. The thunder of gunpowder may have announced the end of the Age of Knights, but it also marked the beginning of an ongoing conversation about what it means to be human in a world where the only constant is change itself.